This episode includes references to suicide. We encourage listener discretion. If you or someone you know is experiencing suicidal thoughts, help is available. Please consult the support links in the episode description. On December 8th, 1920, just short of a year after Charles McDonell returned home from war, his gas-green corpse was found by his landlady. After getting drunk on wine, Charles had turned on the gas and stuck his head in the kitchen oven.
Charles had fallen in love with the face of death. He was a casualty of war, whose wounds bled only the white blood of no hope.
That is a quote from the 1986 autobiography of LGBTQ icon Elsa Gidlow. Despite only knowing Charles for a short period, Elsa preserved his story some 66 years after his untimely end.
This is a story of forbidden queer love in the mud-soaked trenches of the First World War, in the grief and trauma that followed Charles McDonell home, like an unwanted shadow.
This is episode 2 of Lavender Ranks. I'm your host, Carbon.
And I'm Emily.
Now, let's get into the show. Okay, we just started this thing with Charles's tragic demise, so where do we go from here?
I think we've got to rewind and start back at the beginning. Charles, or Charlie, as his friends called him, was an artist through and through. His father, Oscar McDonell, published the Ottawa-based French-language newspaper, Le Temps, which surely set the stage for Charlie's passion for writing and poetry.
Ah, so he's a tortured artist.
Not all artists are tortured, but this one certainly was. Charlie was a lifelong aspiring writer. He worked as an assistant librarian at McGill University, but in his spare time, he wrote novels, poetry, essays, and criticism. On his military attestation papers, his occupation is listed as a journalist.
Did he do anything else?
Oh yeah, he was an amateur actor. This is actually how he became acquainted with the Montreal queer community. He joined a theater company called the Irving Players, which was run by a man named Harcourt Farmer. Harcourt would be instrumental in connecting Charlie to some very iconic queer artists, including Oscar Wilde and Alfred Hausman. They'd become big inspirations for a lot of Charlie's poetry.
He joined that company in 1912 and did a number of performances, even leading up to the outbreak of the war. And their last performance, it seems, that we can find record of, took place in January 1915.
That's Sarah Worthman, who's here to help us get to know Charlie McDonell. Sarah specializes in queer history and the military.
All right. It's getting a little gay in here.
Just a little, because despite connecting with the queer community, during this time, Charlie meets and marries a woman named Marjorie Hamilton.
And fell in love, potentially, with her, although it seems in some records that he was very much depicted as a gay man. However, sexuality, as we know, is quite fluid, which is why we use the term queer.
Well, it happens to the best of us. Some people are born knowing that they're gay, and others are just really strong allies for some reason.
Yep, I've been that ally. So at this point, Charlie is only 24 years old, and just as he's preparing to go off to war, he and his now wife Marjorie have a daughter, Denise.
So Canada entered the First World War in August of 1914, but when did Charlie enlist?
Well, Charlie starts trying to enlist as early as 1914, but he actually fails to do so 6 times.
Okay, I'm confused. How can you fail to enlist in the army? Isn't their whole gig that they want everyone, especially during wartime?
There was a lot of different soldiers rejected for a variety of reasons. And I did some research into this because Frederick Hardy, who is the only known queer soldier on the Vimy Memorial, he was rejected a number of times for being, in quotations, inefficient. So there's a number of different reasons why this could take place. It really could be anything though, from varicose veins to flat feet. And then eventually, as the war got on, they allowed more people.
So do we know why Charlie would have been rejected so many times?
It doesn't show anything on his records. Like sometimes when they've been rejected and then enlist a couple of times, it'll show. But it does show that he has some, it does mention his glasses and the fact that he didn't have the best vision. So that very much could have been the case. But yeah, it's not entirely clear.
Charlie finally successfully enlists in 1916 as a private in the 242nd Battalion alongside 1,049 other recruits. The 242nd Battalion was being mobilized in Montreal, but recruited from all provinces except for Manitoba and Prince Edward Island.
Question for you. Charlie is a writer and an amateur actor. How does he become a soldier?
Well, basic training doesn't happen for Charlie until after he's overseas. Essentially, once enlisted, he boards a ship, the SS Mauretania, and takes the 7-day journey from Halifax to the UK.
I can imagine that 7 days crossing the ocean before receiving any basic training would be a little anxiety-inducing, no?
Oh, I'd be nervous, crying, throwing up. As a soldier, once you stepped on that ship, your life was already at risk. It was 7 days to cross the Atlantic, and the entire time you were at risk of a U-boat attack. German U-boats sank 45 Canadian steamships during the First World War, leading to 5,000 casualties.
Yikes.
What's interesting is the SS Mauretania was actually a luxury liner. It held the record for the quickest transatlantic crossing, but for the war, she was converted into a troop carrier and a hospital ship.
Oh, a luxury liner, so it wouldn't have been so bad.
Well, despite her pre-war luxury status, I don't think this would have been a pleasant experience for the troops. Each soldier would have been given a hammock to sleep in and a life belt, which was to be worn at all times and taken off only to sleep.
Got it. So after the cruise from hell, they arrive in England. What happens next?
Like many Canadians who joined up with the Canadian Expeditionary Force, Charlie completed his basic training at Whitley Camp in Surrey, England. And after spending several months training, Charlie is sent to France, where he was transferred to the 3rd Battalion Canadian Machine Gun Corps, then attached to the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles Battalion.
Meaning his specialty was guns and shooting?
I gather.
And we don't know much about his time in war. Unfortunately, all of his writings are lost to history, but we do know from Elsa Gidlow's diary and her autobiography.
Now, here's where things get a little spicy.
They usually do with a historic lesbian diary.
We do know from Elsa Gidlow's diary that while he was overseas and while he was actually in the trenches, he fell in love with one of his fellow soldiers.
This would be the first queer love trauma bond final boss, I'm sure of it.
I mean, I can't imagine that falling in love in the trenches would lead to a healthy attachment. Regardless, they spend 9 months together, Charlie and this unnamed soldier, falling in love and eventually, according to Elsa's recounting, making love there in the trenches.
Have you imagined what that would have been like?
Oh my god, I've imagined it all right. Writing gay wartime fan fictions about her historical figures has become somewhat of a new hobby for me, you could say. Do you want to hear it?
Obviously.
Okay. Unfortunately, we don't know the identity of Charlie's lover. His name isn't recorded in Elsa's writing, so I'm going to name our mystery man Christopher for the purpose of my fanfiction.
I'll allow it.
In the cold mudlands along the Western Front, I imagine Charlie in his uniform that is more often dirty than it is clean, living in a constant state of fear while being positioned on the front lines. Remember, Charlie was a writer, an artist. It's easy to imagine that he was searching for some kind of reprieve, a scrap of beauty, of gentleness, in all of that muck and despair. And then Christopher arrived. The two of them connected immediately. Their conversations flowed with a comfortable kind of ease. Their time together felt like something the two men missed so deeply. It felt like home. I picture them laughing together in the YMCA tents as they were supposed to be writing letters home. Their glances began to linger, a second too long, and then two, until their eyes carried whole sentences. Neither dared to speak aloud. A hidden language of queer longing, blooming in the shadows. They were in each other's lives for 9 months. They grew extremely close at that time, both men aching with desire to dissolve the space between them and meld their bodies into one. Christopher is a mess of nerves, his heart pounding louder than the distant shelling as he debates over and over how to bridge the tiny space between them. And then the gunfire erupts in the distance, a reminder of how thin the line is between life and loss. And Christopher stops thinking, his hand brushes over Charlie's. Neither of them can find a breath, but Charlie, without hesitation, grabs Christopher's hand and pulls it close to his chest, as if to say, "Here, feel this, feel what you do to me." Then, one night, they find themselves alone, away from prying eyes, and they make love for the first time, transforming those trenches into something else, something unrecognizable. A graveyard becomes their sacred meeting place, their desire for one another a refuge. Then, just a few days later, Christopher is killed in action. Charlie finds his lifeless body in the mud. This moment will haunt him for the rest of his life.
Oof. You should self-publish that.
Thank you. I mean, I guess we're kind of publishing it here. Like so many other soldiers at war, Charlie didn't get the luxury of taking time to grieve. He had to keep fighting.
I can also imagine that because their love was a secret, no one around him would truly understand the depths of his grief.
I mean, thankfully they were never caught, and Charlie actually was never charged with gross indecency.
After all that, he managed to walk away with a clean record?
Well, I wouldn't call it a clean record. Right at the end of the war, Charlie was arrested twice, and he was actually sentenced to death by firing squad.
For being gay?
No, this had nothing to do with him being a sexual deviant, but he was stirring up trouble in other ways for the Canadian Expeditionary Force.
The next historical record that we have of Charles occurs in the demobilization period, where he was part of a number of riots that took place.
So in 1918, an armistice was signed, signifying the end of the war, but it wasn't until a year later that many troops, Charlie included, actually got to go home.
Oh my God, I'd be so antsy.
A lot of soldiers were. Demobilization was a very lengthy process, and not only were soldiers upset about how long it was taking, but they were also being held in poor conditions. Substandard food, a lack of information, tobacco shortages, and there were reports of excessive discipline and a lot of unwarranted parading and pointless marching going on. These things led to unrest among soldiers and eventually rioting.
Rioting?
Yeah, the Kimmel Park riot is probably the best known of these incidents, especially in a Canadian context. In March of 1919, frustrations boiled over. Cancelled shipping schedules, a beer shortage, and resentments among some soldiers over the perceived prioritization of other troops resulted in 3 days of rioting.
Jeez.
Yeah. You can see photos of the aftermath online. It's wild. Literal buildings torn apart. But for Charlie, he specifically got caught up in a revolt in Neville, Belgium.
In an interview with The Star, he describes the nonstop march to the German frontier after a month of drilling at Mons, bad food, and heavy packs. The smoldering discontent of the 9th Brigade came to a head.
The unrest began in the middle of a 4-day march to the German frontier. When troops reached the historic Belgian city, they had already been marching for 2 days with substandard rations that included a lack of bread and wormy meat.
Ooh, I'd revolt too.
So then, in the evening of December 14th,
they protested. Hundreds of them refused to march. And many of them wanted to march on what was then the guard room because of a soldier who was, they believed, unfairly arrested and thrown in the prison for carrying his rifle on the wrong shoulder.
Divisional headquarters were calling this a mutiny. In an attempt to quell the unrest, they requested members be selected from various battalions to voice the soldiers' concerns and act as representatives for their fellow soldiers. Charlie, being a very outspoken individual, was one of the 8 chosen.
That's our social justice prince.
Unfortunately, this is how the higher-ups entrap the most vocal members of the group. When the 8 began addressing their higher-ups, each was arrested on the charge of leading a mutiny.
That's so shady.
The military called them the Tournai 8, and they were tried and convicted in military court. McDonell was sentenced by court-martial to 5 years imprisonment for attempting to persuade members of His Majesty's forces to join a mutiny and sedition. The others received similar sentences.
What's going on with the military at the time that they're imprisoning veterans who just want wormless meat?
And I'm nowhere near an expert in any of this, but a couple of articles that I've read on the subject mention a very well-liked lieutenant colonel in the brigade. His name was Charles Stewart, but he was killed in action on the 28th of September, 1918. And this loss was really felt, and this trust that existed between the military administration and the actual men on the ground kind of started to dissipate in that time period. You know, men were forced to march in full kit and were really resentful of the new commander that took in place, whose name was Clark. But I think part of it was maybe perceived, but maybe real, that people didn't have the same sense of like urgency or duty as opposed to when the war was actually going on, right? And so there was this pressure to keep up the military discipline.
I don't think I'd fare well in the military. But how does Charlie go from being sentenced to 5 years imprisonment to a death sentence?
Well, Charlie clearly didn't learn his lesson, and in the face of poor prison conditions, he essentially starts another riot, this time with fellow military inmates. This is how Charlie described the military prison.
The stews were filthy and often to the last degree disgusting and offensive. On more than one occasion, worms and slugs were found in it. When the water pipes were frozen, we neither washed nor drank, and as many as 30 men bathed in the same water. Even men with skin diseases were not always isolated and had to wash with the rest. But as abhorrent and humiliating as was the physical atmosphere of the place, it was the mental atmosphere that was the most insidiously and heartlessly cruel. To be sneered at, jeered at, and insulted in such filthy, abusive language.
In the face of such revolting prison conditions, Charlie and the other inmates start a riot that gets so serious that the governor of the prison calls in troops, giving them instructions to shoot any man trying to escape.
That's wild.
At his trial, Charlie refuses to call witnesses, fearing they would face retribution.
So he did learn something from the aftermath of the previous riot.
Yeah, I guess he did. So instead of calling witnesses, he addressed the military tribunal eloquently for more than an hour, chastising authorities over the conditions in the prisons.
I feel like this situation does show a lot about his character, though. Not only was Charlie an outspoken advocate, but the moral standards you have to uphold to not give anyone else up is really admirable. How is his hour-long speech received?
Not well, honestly.
Oof.
Charlie gets convicted for a second time with mutiny, but this time he's sentenced to death by firing squad. In an interview with the Toronto Star, he says,
My death warrant was handed down to me in a sealed envelope, and I was placed in solitary confinement. And for an attempt to smuggle a letter to my wife, I was given 5 days with just bread and water.
In that same interview, he goes on to say that the prison he was held in was absolute hell upon earth, and that he was driven to the verge of suicide.
Okay, time out. Am I the only one that thinks that the death penalty is so outlandish for this crime?
I had the exact same thoughts, so I dug into this a little bit more. First of all, it seems like handing out the death sentence was not an uncommon practice. During the First World War, 309 British and Commonwealth soldiers were executed for desertion and other capital offenses. Military law at that time was designed to preserve obedience at all costs. While at war, soldiers are essentially treated as property, instruments of war, rather than citizens with rights. And military law was used as a tool to force compliance and deter desertion or dissent of any kind.
Okay, interesting. So this was considered necessary during wartime. Was the general society aware of this and okay with what was happening?
Not really. Charlie had to smuggle a letter to his wife Marjorie for her to even find out what was happening. Thankfully, back in Canada, Marjorie received the smuggled letter and she took up his case. She actually fully relocated from Montreal to Toronto because she thought that it would be easier to accomplish it from there.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if I got word that my husband, brother, or son was alive by the end of war, but was sentenced to death, I would be seeing red.
Oh, absolutely. Marjorie went to the press. She wrote several letters to Ottawa in which she informed officials that all males in her family of fighting age had enlisted. 2 of her husband's older brothers fought in the Great War, and 1 was killed in France with the Royal Flying Corps.
So she basically said, do you know who I am?
She's not the one, clearly. Fortunately, her campaign and advocacy was ultimately successful. She got Charlie and the 7 others convicted alongside him a full pardon. And 7 months later, in November of 1919, Charlie sailed home aboard the SS Tunisian.
My God, this poor man. He falls in love at war, sees his lover die in the trenches, and then finishes off his service with the most inhumane physical and psychological treatment possible.
Charlie went through the ringer. By all accounts, he returned to civilian life a husk of the man he once was. He's completely traumatized by the carnage of war, the loss of his partner, and his imprisonment and looming death sentence.
This feels like a recipe for PTSD.
They'd call it shell shock.
The first cases of shell shock appeared in the fall of 1914 after the retreat from Mons and the Battle of the Marne.
This is Cameron Telch. Cameron is a doctoral candidate with the Faculty of Education at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax. He is writing his dissertation on the representation of shell shock in Canadian war museums.
When soldiers appeared at regimental aid stations with no physical symptoms, but appeared in a state of daze and disoriented, doctors did not know what they were encountering for the first time. In fact, historian Wendy Holden describes it as a strange new condition. It caught the medical guard completely off guard, as this was not recognized in previous British military and Canadian conflicts.
It was coined shell shock in 1915 by Dr. Charles Myers. At the time, it was believed to result from a physical injury to the nervous system during a heavy bombardment or shell attack.
Myers initially thought that it was a microlesion from the impact of shell explosion that had caused some sort of head concussion or brain trauma to the soldiers. But he would later come to regret the term because in his perspective, soldiers were displaying not just physical symptoms, but also psychological symptoms.
And Charlie was one of them?
He never gets a formal diagnosis of shell shock, but soldiers like Charlie, who only started displaying symptoms after the war, seem to have really fallen through the cracks. The military was uninterested in helping him, and no one in his close circle was equipped to.
During the First World War, shell shock was associated with social and cultural beliefs like insanity or childhood trauma or poor genetics. And because it was a time where mental health was scrutinized, most soldiers did not write or discuss their personal feelings to their families or to their loved ones. Most soldiers instead endured the hardships of the Great War and kept going forward.
And there was something else Cameron shared. He underlined that there was also a consideration of masculinity and class that factored into a diagnosis of shell shock. Officers, for example, were more likely to be diagnosed with neurasthenia.
And neurasthenia was a more acceptable form of shell shock, where it was believed that officers were suffering from true anxiety neurosis because of their upbringing, because of their background, intelligence, and social obligation.
Whereas a soldier from the rank and file,
They were diagnosed with hysteria. And again, it was another form of shell shock. A soldier with a diagnosed term of hysteria was seen as unpatriotic, undesirable. And because historically hysteria has been tied to women, they're also accused of displaying of feminine behavior with a diagnosis of hysteria.
So, a potentially fraught diagnosis for a queer man in custody.
right. So no, Charlie was never diagnosed with shell shock, and we have no record that he sought such a diagnosis, but he returned from the war a wounded man. He was never able to adapt to domestic life with his wife and daughter. In fact, in Montreal, after he came back from war, he became lovers with Harcourt Farmer. You might remember him. I mentioned Farmer earlier as the gentleman who ran the Irving Players.
And Harcourt Farmer, in Elsa Gidlow's words, the famous poet, describes him as having a dark, slightly sullen, dissipated face, handsome at times and thin, with a nervous body that he handled gracefully. Again, it's all through the eye of the beholder. Of course, Elsa was quite famously a lesbian, so she perhaps wasn't looking for maybe the attractive features of Harcourt.
Unfortunately, Harcourt soon ends things with Charlie.
Loving someone who's struggling with their mental health is really tough. When your cup is full, you are able to support it, but your cup isn't always full. And at a certain point, it can feel like you're only giving and you're unequipped to properly support them.
Yeah, I've definitely been on both ends of that equation. After the breakup with Harcourt, Charlie moves to New York's Greenwich Village, leaving Marjorie and his daughter Denise behind in Montreal. He sets out on the Big Apple with a very determined mission to find a publisher for his poetry collection.
Pause. After Marjorie saves his life, he just leaves them?
I know, I winced when I read it for the first time.
I love telling imperfect stories because I think in queer history, especially in this effort we've been seeing lately to kind of commemorate and acknowledge these histories in an important way. But what often happens is there's this sanitization of the history. We want these people to be palatable, perfect characters.
I guess. To share only the sanitized stories does feel like it plays into the assimilationist narrative that queer people need to fit into society in order for us to be deserving of basic human rights.
Exactly. In the book Bad Gays, A Homosexual History, authors Lemmy and Miller propose that if the price of acceptance is a kind of social sainthood, an anodyne and sanitized and unthreatening model minority, perhaps that price has become too high to pay.
We want to make these characters perfect. We want to make these people a sanitized version of history, but the reality is a lot more deep and complex. And I think to me, it almost makes them feel more human. None of us are perfect. All of us are always learning. All of us make bad mistakes. I mean, not all of us leave our wives and child, but we all kind of are complicated human beings just navigating the world we live in. And of course, a very common feature of depression, psychologically, is you cut yourself off from other people, right? You isolate yourself, you alienate yourself. Part of me wonders if that was part of this, right? Cutting off the people that love you, because in a way it makes suicide, and this is really heavy, but it makes it easier. You have less people relying on you, depending on you. I don't know.
Obviously, with historical figures, we can never assume how they would have acted if they existed in a time period where homosexuality wasn't criminalized. But I can imagine that Charlie might have felt unable to disclose his true identity to his wife and daughter, so he had to leave them behind?
Probably. This was a very difficult time to be a queer person, and we should keep that in mind when we reflect on Charlie's choices and his character. Luckily for Charlie, as he sets out for New York City, Harcourt sends a letter connecting him to iconic poets and LGBTQ icons Elsa Gidlow and Roswell George Mills, who are living in New York at the time.
Harcourt wrote this letter to Roswell. And at this time period, you can tell that they were very much broken up. Whatever they had was over. And Harcourt writes, "I can't keep coddling him. He's always in the bloody dumps, reciting Houseman, talking about corpses. He's leaving for New York. See if you can stand him."
Roswell took on Charlie as both a friend and lover. He found him charming and sad.
Okay, not to sound dumb, but what makes Elsa and Roswell LGBTQ icons?
That's not a dumb question at all. They're kind of niche historical figures, but the way they live their lives absolutely makes them icons. Together, Elsa and Roswell, who are originally from Montreal, formed the first known queer magazine in North America. It was published between 1918 and 1920. It was written by queer folks and openly concerned with queer issues. They called it Les Mouches Fantastiques. It's filled with poetry, essays, and social commentary.
Is it good?
So, at the time, Les Mouches Fantastiques got some bad reviews. When the magazine was first published, it was notably ridiculed by none other than horror writer H.P. Lovecraft in his own magazine, The Conservative. He felt that Elsa and Roswell were stifled by their, quote, bondage to the lower regions of the senses.
But how is it perceived through queer eyes? I'm assuming someone with a magazine titled The Conservative isn't going to be the most fruity.
Good question. Elsa defended her own publication in public, and the exchange brought her some initial negative attention. However, another writer came to their defense, and it was Reverend Graham Davis, an Anglican minister from South Dakota, and a fascinating character for sure. Davis published a long essay praising Les Mouches Fantastiques before getting in touch with Roswell, which moved from literary topics to more intimate ones, which ultimately led the Reverend to travel to Montreal and to start a love affair with Roswell.
Pretty juicy historical footnote.
Yeah. One thing about Elsa is that her writing exposed a lot of priests and ministers. The Reverend, it seems, did not view his ministry and his sexuality as inherently contradictory, though I should note he kept his sexuality from his congregation.
So, what do you think of Les Mouches?
Well, sadly, only one issue is widely available, and if I'm being honest, from a modern perspective, Les Mouches felt less than fantastique. It almost didn't feel revealing or hard-hitting enough. It kind of just felt like a collection of incomplete thoughts.
I think this ties into the discussion we had around wanting queer people, past and present, to be perfect or finished. But that's not realistic, is it? Especially when we put them in the context of when they existed. What I'm personally most inspired by is the fact that Elsa and Roswell published their thoughts as queer people at a time when their identities could honestly land them in jail.
Absolutely. And not only that, but Elsa Gidlow did all of this as a self-taught writer. She came from poverty, and it's unclear whether she ever had the opportunity to attend school, but she speaks of a deep longing to learn in proper school. But beyond the magazine, Elsa gives queer history geeks a huge gift.
And what is that?
She wrote an autobiography in 1986 titled Elsa, I Come With My Songs. This book gives us an intimate portrait into the LGBTQ community before the gay liberation movement, which is something that's so rarely seen in any country, but especially in the Canadian context. Before the gay liberation movement, for their own safety, the lives of queer people were very much hidden. So all historians have, for the most part, are muffled in vague fragments, a bit of poetry or a line of testimony in someone else's record. But with Elsa Gidlow, she name drops the incredible artists in her circle and gives us an intimate look into their real and imperfect lives. So we can finally see how LGBT people of the time lived, loved, and saw themselves.
Who was in this circle?
They crossed paths with Oscar Wilde, for instance, but her inner circle had some pretty interesting characters. One of my favorite stories is about a gay man named Henry Lacouture. He discovered he was gay through the church. He had been a devout seminary student and believed he was going to become a priest, but he became tormented when he fell in love with another student, a boy named Jean. Wrestling with his gay feelings, Lacouture went to confession. He cried, he confessed it all, and waited for his punishment. But instead, the priest, a Father Francis, told him to meet him at the parish house for what would be Lacouture's first sexual experience.
Oh my God.
He left his career at the church after that and became part of Elsa and Roswell's inner circle. And very fitting of his name, Lacouture became a notable fashion designer, making clothes for very wealthy women.
Elsa was spilling all the boys' secrets in her tell-all. I wonder if she got everyone's consent?
It's hard to say. For Lacouture and Charlie, at least, both were dead before the book's release, so they couldn't have given their consent. But this book was filled with countless stories of the intimate lives of lesbian and gay people in her circle. It's really quite a special read.
And this is where she wrote about Charlie?
That's right. She dives quite deeply into his mental state after the war as she perceives it. She shares how Charlie had been quite deeply traumatized by his experiences on the front lines, but it seems he was never able to find anyone particularly sympathetic.
What was his relationship with Elsa like?
She describes him as young and passionate and that he loved and wrote poetry. However, in his pursuit to be published, he brought some of his poetry to Elsa in hopes that she would publish it in the magazine that she was working for. But by her own accounts, Elsa didn't accept any of it. She found it sentimental and derivative of another poet's work. She writes that the first time he tried to kill himself, she wondered if her turning down his verses had added to the last straw of his overload of depression.
What do you think?
I think we always want an answer in the wake of a suicide, but the only person who has that answer is dead.
The transition of integrating back into civilian life was a stressful process for many of these veterans. They often experienced loss of income. Family members could not understand their perspective, strained family relationships, or even some veterans died by suicide because of the stigma of mental health. And in terms of how common it was, in 1919 alone, 40% of suicides were related to Canadian veterans of the First World War.
Was Roswell also unsympathetic?
Apparently, Roswell consoled him until he grew wary of combating his complaining. Elsa remembers an interaction between Roswell and Charlie.
Come on, laugh, Charliekins. Eat, drink, here, have more wine. Be merry now. Now's all we've got.
Stop it! I can't stand it. You haven't seen them. 10 million corpses. 10 million of them. They were young like us, alive like us. They ate and they drank and they were merry and I loved them. I made love with one of them in the trenches where he became a corpse.
Of course, we only see fragments of his post-war life, but is Charlie's experience in line with other veterans who experienced shell shock?
According to the Canadian War Museum, doctors diagnosed nearly 10,000 Canadians with shell shock. These soldiers experienced paralysis, insanity, stress, crying, and fear from being exposed to the stress and horror of the trenches. And unfortunately, what they found to be the most effective method was electroshock therapy.
Oh, Jesus.
There were two main schools of thought. You either had the disciplinary approach or the analytical approach. The leading figure for the disciplinary approach was led by a Canadian doctor named Dr. Louis Eland, and he ran the National Hospital out of the UK. Yealand approached more of a harsher measure towards shell shock patients in which he applied electric shock therapy. He believed that if patients continued to be unresponsive, they needed to be reminded of their duty through electric shock therapy. In other words, torture into submission. He took a cynical view towards shell shock, in which he believed that it did not exist as a medical condition. On the flip side, when it comes to the analytical approach, it was led by doctors, including doctors W.H.R. Rivers. Rivers took a more humane approach during the First World War, in which he developed a talking cure regime. He believed that it was important for soldiers to discuss and to experience their grief in order to overcome their fear and their sorrow.
Unfortunately for soldiers like Charlie, who only started exhibiting signs of shell shock after returning home from war, there were very few treatment programs and they were left traumatized in the hands of ill-equipped friends or family members. In Elsa's memoir, she writes,
Despite the way he talked, we did not believe he would kill himself.
People who talk that much about it don't do it.
Roswell said.
They spew out all their gall in words.
But he did do it.
After drinking wine on his own, Charlie turned on the gas and stuck his head in the oven. His landlady found him, as well as a note that said, "Call Mr. Mills," with Roswell's number on it. Elsa and Roswell showed up to Charlie's apartment and they, quote,
Saw him in the pine box. I never forgot how he looked, that beautiful young man. Green, old, and stiff, and green. A gas green corpse.
Oh man, that's so hard.
However, Elsa does share some very poetic thoughts about her own mental health struggles around this time. She says,
Wrestling with my own despairs, I thought I knew how Charlie had felt, but I probably did not. Charles had fallen in love with the face of death. My present despair was life's seeming denial of me. To long for surcease of struggle is not the same as voluntarily climbing into one's grave.
While this story is dark, Charlie's existence is not entirely overshadowed by sorrow. Despite never really knowing him, his daughter Denise followed in his footsteps, and her life proved to be a bright light. Upon the outbreak of the Second World War, she enlisted with the Canadian Women's Army Corps and eventually rose to the rank of captain. After the war, she lived in Kingston with her husband and 2 children and worked at Queen's University, and like her father, she was an amateur actor. While working at York University in the early days of that institution, she advocated for student housing, and upon her death in 1981, a bursary was created in her name that continues to be available to students today.
Thank you. I needed a little positivity.
Yeah, I thought so. I so wish I could end this episode with a reading of Charlie's poetry, but sadly he was never successful in publishing his work, and it has all been lost to time. However, Charlie's friend and once lover, Harcourt Farmer, eulogized him in the pages of the Montreal Gazette. Harcourt described Charlie as a
glittering and complex mind who tasted life to the fullest and found it, at the end, bitter.
If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of self-harm, help is available. You can find resources in this episode's show notes. Next time on Lavender Ranks.
During the First World War, female friendships were most definitely encouraged, and there were no fears, as there were about male homosexuality. It never seems to have occurred to authorities that women could love each other in that way as well.
Lavender Ranks is an original production of Knockabout Media in collaboration with Queer Collective. This series is hosted by me, Emily Giascos, and Carbon. Executive produced by Ryan Barnett and written by Emily Giascos.
Lavender Ranks was made possible with funding from Veterans Affairs Canada's Commemorative Partnership Program.
Our series consultant is Sarah Worthman, with additional research provided by
Dr. Serafina Pagnotta.
This episode features interviews with
Cameron Telch,
Sarah Worthman.
If you're an educator and wish to incorporate this podcast into your classroom, we have created a list of discussion questions that can be found in the show notes or downloaded at knockaboutmedia.com.
Thanks for listening.
And now
talk about the media original. Hold on.